Test, test, test.
Hello, hello. Is that better? Okay.
Live mic check. Mic check, mic check.
test, 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 test. Test, test, test. You have me? Yep. Better? Teresa, I'm so...
Test 1, 2, 3.
let's go ahead and call this meeting to order. To view the live streaming video, the live stream video of this meeting, please go to the Kilmer School District 38 YouTube page on the district website. Ron, could you lead us in a Pledge of Allegiance this morning?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So, welcome to our work session, and I want to emphasize the word work in the form of Q&A particularly. So I want everyone to feel really open and ready to ask questions, add your contributions, your insights, etc., so that we can make some good progress today. With that, our first item.
Can you do a roll call?
Sorry. It looks like Shanna and Bob Foster will be talking about a couple issues. Fees update, strategic plan update. Do you want to do that one at a time or together?
Mr. Taylor?
I think they're prepared to do it together.
Let's do it together then.
Mr. Taylor, while they're walking up, would you like me to do roll call?
Oh, I missed that. Please, Ms. Upchurch, would you do a roll call
I
for
will
us?
do roll call.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Taylor,
Here.
I'm just going to go down the line. Ms. Phillips,
Here.
Ms. Upchurch is here. Mr. Schwartz,
Also here.
Mr. Clausen.
Thank you, Ms. Upchurch.
Okay, so. Testing.
Should be on. Just make sure you're really talking into it.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. All right, so first, we are going to give you a fees update. So we'll go down to, so this is in line with our strategic plan, key goals, and priorities number 4, ensuring effective asset management and efficient use of resources. So if you recall, on August 11th, the board adopted and approved a resolution that stated in point number 7 that the superintendent shall have the authority to modify current fees to reflect student and family use in consideration of modified calendars and attendance expectations during the 2021 school year. So these fees apply for in-person and online students. I just want to note that fees are a supplement to a class or activity. They do not cover the full costs associated with that class or activity. So I think that's just an important piece to have in your mind when it comes to fees. We will be charging those after today's meeting, and those will be due by the end of September. Normally we charge those prior to the start of the school year, but this year we decided to wait to see how the school year started out and how we could best charge the fees so as not to be overcharging and then having to refund, etc. And then just one piece of information to draw your attention to. Every staff member gets a benefit of $50 credit towards fees for each student of that staff member. So that's just one of the benefits that our staff are given as well every year. Class fees and consumables, those are going to remain the same as published because workbooks are still going to be consumed regardless of whether that student is attending in person or online. The parking permit for PRHS and LPHS, we are going to currently reduce that from $85 to the $40 based on the hybrid model that those students are experiencing. However, should we go back to a full-time in-learning, we may need to increase that at that time, but feel that it is most fair to charge a lower amount currently. Athletic fees, again, I want to go back to these fees are only supplemental, and that every year the general fund covers almost $400,000 in athletics program costs over and above what the fees pay for. And so I know a lot of times people feel like the fees may be a little high, but I just want to point out that piece. Yes, sir.
What is the sum total of the athletic costs?
I can get that for you. I don't have that off the top of my head at this point.
Maybe a different way to ask the same question is, thank you, by the way, is what percent of the total cost do we cover out of the general fund? Any thoughts, Mr. Foster?
I would have to look at the historical
Okay.
information and get that to you, but I can certainly find that out for you.
Okay.
What we do not cover, what's not covered for fees are the costs of coaches, which is out of the general fund. And that's a large amount of the cost.
Sure. Good point. Yeah.
Coaching salaries is a chunk.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but I can get you that information.
Well, may I ask a clarifying question? Because if I understood Ron's question right, the general fund covers approximately $400,000 over and above the fees. So from the general fund, we're using $400,000 excluding salaries. Is that correct? Including.
My question is actually quite remedial. I apologize for making it more challenging than it needs to be.
No, I understand what you're asking. I just don't have that information
What
off the top of
percent
my
of the
head.
total athletic program costs are we covering versus the participants? That's all.
Right. I will get you that information.
I do think it's also important to recognize that typically what the fees are covering are the supplies, the uniforms, the
Equipment.
training facility rentals, it's pretty much everything outside of the lane of what our general fund is covering when it comes to the salaries of our staff that are actually coaching. So typically the fees are going toward exactly what those items are, but they're not enough to cover all of those costs by themselves.
Right, and several of the athletic teams have boosters and fundraisers, and be interesting to understand what it really costs to do it.
And that goes above and beyond because obviously we're looking at different sports and different needs related
Yep.
to each of those sports on
Sure.
top of it. Yep.
Hockey rents ice.
Yep.
Swimming rents pool time, et cetera, and so on and so forth.
But to build on what Ron's bringing up, which is a great point, even in transportation, what's our cost versus what's the contribution or the fees, and what's that relative percentage is good information for all of these fees.
Yeah, I'd just like to know how we stack up against our peers, for example, and if we're providing a wonderful incremental opportunity or maybe need to step up to at least have parity. That's all.
Okay. Yep. I can absolutely get you that information. And again, so these fees are going to remain the same as they originally were published back in the spring. The transportation fees, again, we are going to reevaluate those at semester end and credit or refund the families as appropriate based on their actual usage due to the hybrid model, et cetera.
I have a question.
Yes.
How easy if at semester's end, let's say something not using our bus service, decide to refund parents? What measures do we have in place to make that transition smooth?
The refund
Yes.
itself?
Yes.
So what we will do is we will first credit their accounts and then determine do they want to leave that on there to pay for a different fee that they may be incurring, or do they want us to refund them? Any other questions on fees?
I have a question.
Yes.
Have people already paid their parking fees?
No, parking fees have
Okay.
not been collected yet.
So and I understand they're different departments or entities. in the case of transportation, you decided to refund at the semester, but in the case of parking, you're reducing the cost now. Can you just explain
The logic.
why you're doing those differently?
Yeah, so the transportation is a function of needing a commitment from families in order to determine routes for each student. And what has been determined over the years is that financial commitment also helps parents to get on board ahead of time versus waiting. And so every year when we're having to put together the routes and make sure all students that need busing are covered, this has been the way to make sure that we have that information ahead of time and have that time. The parking is not as big of an issue, and that is done at the campus level. So each of the high schools are in charge of giving out the parking passes, et cetera. So what we talked with them about this year was to go ahead and give out the parking passes, but not charge the fee, that we would collect the fee after we determined what was most appropriate. So that's kind of the difference.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question too, real
Mhm.
quick. Teresa, you brought up a thought I had. The parking fees, what do those fees go towards?
Parking fees, one, it's a way to help continue to maintain the parking lot. Those have to be restriped regularly, et cetera. So again, it's a supplemental fee that just helps with the actual costs related to having more cars in the parking lot.
We can spend anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000 just patching potholes.
That was going to be a question I had.
Let alone what it costs, excuse me, to actually repave the lot. And the striping is an annual cost of several $1,000s, just in supplies, not in man hours that it takes to actually go out there and paint the lines. That's another part of it. So it's a large cost.
Anything else on fees?
Yeah, this is a little off subject, I think, but it's about transportation. Has the district had any conversations at all with Monument Academy and their new facility out on the east bench about transportation and potentially utilizing our transportation fixed cost and charge them for it, obviously? But I'm just curious if there's been any conversations from them or any thoughts internally.
They had initiated a conversation back in, I want to say, the March time frame, and I think that was correct if I remember correctly. And they never followed through with any of that conversation
It
regarding
was
that.
pre-pandemic.
Pre-pandemic,
Yeah.
yes.
They reached out to you? Is that?
It was part of a conversation where that had been brought up, that subject had been brought up, but they never followed through with the conversation regarding that. Due to their different start times and the fact that that campus serves a middle and a high, it could make
Well,
yeah,
no, those details
problematic.
are beyond me.
Yeah.
I get that. I'm just wondering whether or not there's been any conversation.
there had been a conversation. They had not come back to the table with any conversation regarding that since that time.
It was more idea-based. I don't think there was
Yeah, I
anything
don't
that was
think there was
formal
any kind of-
behind it. So it was just kind of an acknowledgement. Yes, it's there. If you're interested to pursue it, let us know. And at that time, we didn't hear anything back.
That's
So,
the fact.
so from your perspective, it's in their court. if
Correct.
There were follow-up conversations.
I think it's possible that they could be looking at that down the road. I don't think there's any intent to create an arrangement for this school year.
No, I understand. That's what I wanted to understand. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
On a macro basis, are there any of these reductions in fees, is the sum total of these reduction in fees an impact to the budget at all?
Oh, absolutely, yes. So when we go through all of our budget adjustments, you'll see what that sum total is. I don't have that number off the top of my head at this point, but it will be part of the adjusted budget that we will present later in the fall.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else on fees?
Follow up to Mr. Schwartz. So if, with transportation, if we're looking at the budget later in the fall and if we find out we need to refund, will we be able to have it, know what our reserves are to be able, if we have to backfill? Can we get that information?
Yeah,
When-
absolutely.
If we have to cross that bridge, I think it'd be helpful to have that information as well.
Absolutely. Okay. Moving on. So again, we are still covering our strategic plan goal number 4. Developing short and long range plans for effective facility utilization. So we're going to talk about cap reserve, building reserve, and then our general fund reserve analysis we're going to revisit from a few months back. So cap reserve, budgeted available funds this year is about 1.2 million. Of that 1.2 million, 884,000 is what is budgeted to come from the general fund. So keep that in mind. These are the 2021 projects expenditures. We have $115,000 to be expended for the bus leasing. We have $150,000 just in general repairs and maintenance, playground, concrete, blacktop, fencing, drainage, etc. All those things that our maintenance team works on every year. About $659,000 is projected for the Prairie Winds roof as well as the controllers at Bear Creek. And then we have a $250,000 contingency set aside to help cover some ramp and ADA compliance issues at LPHS. The building reserve fund.
Before we leave the
Yeah.
capital reserve fund, is the capital reserve generally the same term as deferred maintenance? Or not necessarily deferred maintenance, but it's maintenance, capital maintenance projects, right?
Yes,
Okay.
large ticket items.
Is there a line or tipping point where you get to common daily stuff versus large scale? I mean, is it stuff over $100,000, for example?
Probably stuff $50,000 to $75,000
And up.
And up,
Okay.
yeah. Mostly stuff that we can plan for too. We do have part of the 710 account would include monies for that stuff that breaks in the year that has to be fixed.
Yep.
So then within the building reserve funds, we have almost $2.5 million, and that is made up of the MA land sale of $1.2 million, the $1.1 million geothermal settlement for Prhs, $63,000 for Woodmore Water easement sale, and $27,000 made up of fees in lieu of land and interest on those investment funds. And then we talked about previously the $73,000 LPMS land sale that is still pending the receipt of those funds.
That's also the Woodmore Water though, correct?
Correct.
So are those different?
Yes,
The
those are
63
two
and the
different amounts.
73?
Correct. So I just want to draw your attention to the MA land sale. Those funds are committed specifically for the purpose of acquiring real property for future school sites per a board resolution signed and dated on September 27th of 2018. So those funds are not available for anything else at this point outside of another board resolution, is my understanding. And then as well, the geothermal settlement for PRHS, the original settlement was 1.17. We have paid out about $6,900 to the engineering of that system. This is an 8-stage retrofit, and the first stage alone is estimated to cost about $1 million. We do not have full cost estimates for remaining stages yet, but Bob is working on that, I believe.
Can we take a couple minutes and get inside of this for purposes of, given the dollar amount and the potential impact? One of the questions I had in reading through this over the weekend was And they may be quite remedial, and I know I'm new on the board, and this may have been for the other folks. If so, we can take it offline, if it's common knowledge for everybody. So having prefaced that, what does the geothermal system provide for the employees and the students at the school? Is it functioning today? If we get it completely back and operational, do we offset any costs that we're incurring because it's not operational?
Yes, the geothermal system is operating.
Okay, what does it do?
It provides heating and cooling
Okay.
to the building through the heat exchange, through the geothermal ground exchange stuff. The boreholes where it was failing, and some people may remember this, was that the bore fields were failing. For a variety of reasons, there were some design, what we believe to be some design errors, and that was what the lawsuit was about. And so the first step is to replace the bore fields themselves and to re-drill those bore fields, probably to a greater depth than the originals. Will be decommissioned just in case. Those original lines, several of the pair headers, which is 20, 30 bores at a time, had failed in the past. And if they continue to fail at the rate they were failing, the geothermal system would have been inoperable. Foreseeing that possibility prior to the lawsuit was a backup heat boiler set in that building. So there is a boiler in there to back up the geothermal in case it ever failed prior to being fixed. The steps, pretty long and complicated. The easiest one is drilling the holes, the new field, designing where that field will go, and then running that field into the building. Preliminarily, we're set to start that. We've discussed setting that up for this coming summer. That depends on the availability of the contractors to do the work. Up till now, they've been involved in the largest geothermal field in the state at Moby, so Moby Arena up at CSU has sort of taken all the labor out of the field on that one. And so we're waiting for them to become available and start our project and design our project. The next steps in that, it's very complicated, but yes, students and staff have heat and cooling because of the geothermal system.
So it appears as though it is disruptive when you make the change.
Yes.
And do the drilling. So that's why you'd want to do it in the summer, right?
There will be some disruption because it will lose cooling capacity for
Yep.
that time until those things are
Right.
done. It's unknown for what amount of time, but we should be able to get it back up in fall in time for student.
And for some reason we missed the window. It appears the way you explain it is that we have the capacity to run for another school year.
Well, we have the capacity right now, foregoing any failures of the boreholes, to continue to run. Yeah.
Okay.
And during this part of the season, we've boiler. We're not cooling during summer. That would be lacking.
Right. If we run the backup, do we incur the cost of utilities?
Yes.
And so that's an incremental cost, right?
It's hard to say that boilers, well, it's efficient, is nowhere near as efficient as geothermal.
Sure.
Yes.
But the geothermal has to work to recognize the efficiency, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah. Thank you.
You bet.
Can I build on what Ron was asking? Because if we have a backup boiler that's only in the case that the geothermal doesn't work, once we go through this rehab, if you will, is that boiler available for a different?
Unknown if that could service any other unit, plus the cost of removing it and putting it someplace else might be prohibitive. I'm not sure what its design specs are and if it could fulfill another.
So you don't know.
Right. At this point, we wouldn't know. Design specs it may be the wisest thing to leave it there.
So Shanna, when do you think we'll have an estimate to complete this project? If indeed phase one consumes most of the available money, the earlier we know what the rest of the cost is, the better.
That's
I
a
would
valid
think
question.
I would think anywhere from 5 to 6 years we can prolong some of the work depending on budgetary needs, and that some of it is not yet. Some of it has to do with the replacement of piping within the building. PVC piping needs to be replaced. That running glycol through it, so those two are not supposed to be used together. So we've replaced sections of that already. And so we can do that sort of piecemeal or and balance that out. Some of the final steps are putting in new heat exchangers and new pumps, actually lower cost pumps, because there'll be less to run the system the way it is redesigned. They've actually tried to make it more efficient the way it's redesigned and use lower horsepower pumps to run it. So,
Well, you lost me at 5 to 6 years. So this project went through a lawsuit,
yes,
and we're able to remediate this with phase 1 or stage 1, and the
Correct.
rest of it is nice to have?
the rest of it is we're going to need to get it replaced. It is part of, the lawsuit didn't cover all of it. We didn't get enough out of the lawsuit to cover everything that was needed to be
I understand.
remediated. Yep.
I go with that, but then when you say it's 5 to 6 years of rehab, then some of it's not urgent.
It is not absolutely urgent, but it will break and it will fail over time. The PVC running glycol has made the PVC brittle, so how long that lasts is up to anyone's guess, because they don't know how long it takes for glycol to make.
Is BDK the engineering firm that is?
BDK is the engineering with Beth Doty. She was the engineer who helped us on our side of the lawsuit, and so she had already done some of the design remediation and evaluation of the system. Is probably the most, she and Terry Proffer with Major Geothermal are probably the two most knowledgeable people on our system, having extensively studied it during the time span of the lawsuit.
Do we have a full plan?
We have an 8-stage plan that outlines it. Beth has come up with an 8-stage plan that outlines each separate thing. And because they knew that we wouldn't get all of the money to do it all at once, that's why they recommended that plan last, and to be as long as we would necessarily may need it to be for capital reasons.
So at no point in time we got a complete plan with a complete cost. We just said, well, we don't know how much money we're going to have, so we'll sort of piecemeal it.
No, we had a complete cost when we went into the lawsuit. It was probably, any number I give you now would be a remembering guess, but it was in excess of $3 million.
No, I'm more interested in the plan than I am
Yeah.
the numbers. So we at one point did have a full plan with full cost?
Well, full plan, full cost, right. We couldn't afford the full plan, full cost, so we segmented it up into
And
steps.
just that number, do you remember the overall total cost?
That was the $3 million.
It was about $3 million.
Yeah, I think it was somewhere in the realm of $3 million when they first came out to remediate the entire.
So it's fair to say that there will be another $2 million possibly
Upwards of $2 million.
over
yes.
the next period of time.
There's some engineering things that they figure will save us money that they have done to maybe pull that overall cost down. But yeah, upwards of $2 million.
Okay.
Mhm. It's more difficult analysis than just a return on investment, because the geothermal provides the cooling for that building. The installation of chilling and HVAC to assume that would be immensely expensive, and I couldn't give you a number on that, but I would say it would probably be far in excess of the $2 million, because that building doesn't have chillers like West Palmer High School in a typical HVAC. It was intended to be provided by the geothermal. So you have the ongoing cost savings, and even though it's got its issues, the geothermal is more efficient than a typical HVAC boiler system. So it's more efficient than that. But to pull out and totally refit the cooling side of that system is extensive. if we had invested that originally, I didn't understand the question. The geothermal will still come in. Fixing the geothermal will be more cost effective than replacing it. There are always the annual costs of keeping the system working, purging separate things, purge valves, new pumps, those things, but no more so, no less so than any other system, and perhaps less than a typical boiler HVAC system. You'll see later in the deferred maintenance that a chiller tower at Lewis Palmer High School is going to be over $800, closer to $900,000. So that's what you're looking at for just a new tower. You put in that aside, I think, see, Lewis Palmer High School has 2 of them. So you'd be looking at 2 of them to replace similar size building, you know what I mean? Probably a little more complex because it's separated, it's not one unit. So you're looking at a fairly complex retrofit, yeah. You'd spend a lot more trying to retrofit that building than trying to fix it. Well, we spend about 1.3 million a year, so about, yeah. Overall, so, you know, of buildings, Palmer Ridge is by far the less expensive of the 2 big high schools. Of the 2 high schools, Palmer Ridge is, even with the geothermal sometimes not working as it should, is less expensive than Lewis Palmer High School to heat and cool. So, and you'll see, like I said later, replacing the chillers over at Lewis Palmer High School is becoming necessary. It's better than the alternative? Or? Yes. Given our scenario? Yeah. And the design of the building? Yes. Yes, we have a relative cost savings on that versus the other typical building. Yes.
Well, since it is a big rock, and Ron, you raised some really good questions. What I would be interested to know, I think, as a board, since we've got $3 million in expenditures sitting in front of us, it would be interesting to know from the original design, build, and construct of Palmer Ridge High School why they chose geothermal as an option, because I would have to think that that report would, or hopefully it exists, that would say, this is why you do it. Here's the efficiency savings over time to make that investment decision originally. Now that we've sunk the cost, I think what Ron's question is incrementally now spending this money, what's the alternatives? But because we've already committed, right, it's probably the best path forward. But it still would be interesting. So for example, if Palmer Ridge High School existed today and didn't have geothermal at all, what would it cost? Not the building, just the heating and cooling system. And how does that compare to what we have?
I've never looked at the breakdown between the two, but it would be considerably more per month for heating and cooling than it is now.
I would have guessed that, but I think it would be useful information to share so that we actually know that the geothermal system wasn't necessarily a mistake, but I don't know that without seeing some data that would suggest no matter what we do, even if we spend this $3 million to put it back into top-notch operating condition, the investment, the original decision was still a good one because of the efficiencies or the cost savings that exist over time. But I'm not hearing that, I don't know that you really have a full picture of that right now.
Not having looked back at the '08 timeframe or why that decision was made.
What about
Yes.
starting from this day forward in terms of the cost of repairing or investing the 3 million to get the geothermal back up and running versus replacing that with another system, and what would the difference be? To me, that would be more helpful and relevant in terms of letting the community know that we're being
I agree with
prudent.
you. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I just think that some of that work may have already been done in terms of the comparability. That's all.
Yeah.
It would be far more costly to, without putting it in dollars off the top of my head, it's going to be far more costly to try to retrofit something on that building than what is in there now.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, but it may just be helpful in explaining why we're moving ahead with a 5 to 6 year plan of repairing a
Right.
geothermal system
I can-
on a building that most people in the community still perceive as new, even though it's not new.
Mr. Foster, we might want to contact the attorney that represented this. My guess is probably some type of analysis was done in the damage section that probably could shed some light on these questions.
True, yes. I can give him a call.
Okay, ready to move on? Okay, so you'll recognize this from back in May, June timeframe. So this is the graph that was shown to the board during another work session, just to show fund balance, where Tabor sits, the policy required fund balance of the 16.67%, and kind of an annualized cash flow in regards to each of those numbers. So that blue line is the annualized cash flow in comparison to the gray line being the fund balance as it plays out through the months of each year. So again, we just wanted to revisit this, that fund balance is the net worth of a fund. So in simple terms, assets minus liabilities. Cash reserves are going to be greater than the fund balance because it does not account for the accrued wages. So if you remember the conversation about the $4.5 million of accrued wages that happens every year based on our contract year being offset from our fiscal year. So cash reserves is approximately 17 million at fiscal year end, with approximately 4.5 million in accrued wages and benefits. So again, if we were to have to cash those out, we would be down to $12 million, $12.5 million. So
Shanna, is this last fiscal year or the current?
So this
fiscal
is revisiting that same conversation
year? So this
that
is
was
the
had.
June 30th, 2020 year end,
Correct.
prior year. Okay.
So, and how it plays into this year. So that $12.7 million is what was budgeted for beginning fund balance. We are still closing out the June 30 year end. And so we will have a more definitive number for you as that year gets finalized. Still looking at about 11.2 in estimated ending fund balance for this 2021 fiscal year. And that includes about 1.48 million in estimated CARES payroll allocation, which comes back to the presentation that I did on what we were projecting for CARES money. Everything else of the CARES money is estimated to be spent on non-budgeted items. And then $1.5 million in estimated reserve appropriation, if you recall that as well. So going back to the purpose of reserves, they are to address unexpected contingencies, to support cash flow throughout the year as cash flow dips low, and one-time expenditures. Yes, sir. It's taking into account the per pupil funding that we believe we're actually going to receive, as well as budget adjustments that are currently being made. That is the current projection. That is the current projection.
Let me just add the other side of that equation. So Ron asked about the dollar amount per pupil. What about the actual student count? Is this been adjusted to reflect whatever our most current estimate is?
Yes. So again, we're working off of a rolling budget that is taking into account regularly all the changes that are being made, so we can finalize that after the October count is finalized.
Excellent.
And we know exactly what that PPOR is going to come in total.
So the revenue adjustment in the current outlook, current rolling forecast, adjusts for price and volume.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. Yes, sir. Yes.
Or is it? Is it on?
Watch this.
Oh, so much better.
Now you're on, Ron.
It's sorry, I just showed my IQ now, didn't I? My question is about the accrued salaries and benefits, which is the orange line on the graph. When we went through this several months ago, it was an area of significant confusion and distraction. And at the end of the day, it's a net zero. And given that it's many millions of dollars, my potential suggestion is, can we create a separate account or bucket for it, take it out? It is accrued, it is set aside. It really isn't a reserve, it is an expense. We just happen to pay it in a lump sum, and I believe it throws the team off. And it's unnecessary, and it creates fetter. And the graph would be cleaner, the discussions would be faster and simpler and more impactful, and to me this is unnecessary. And it just generates confusion. And I don't even like burning time on it today. My point is to save us time going forward. This is never going to go away. It's ongoing. You got $4.5 million that goes in as and $4.5 million that goes out as, and just create another fund number and call it a day. Is that doable? And would it be valuable to the team and the public?
It wouldn't change anything for me because the accrual itself is an account that's set aside for what you're describing. All this is a presentation of what that accrual looks like. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure what you're asking for.
We spent a ton of time on it last spring, and it had to do with cash flow and timing, frankly. And at the end of the day, it was completely irrelevant. And my concern is I don't want to go down this road again. And I don't want us to have to go down this road again. And to me, it's just part of salaries. It just happens to be a lump sum you pay in a different way. But it's irrelevant. What does the team want? This is more a question for the team, I think.
It reflects GASB accounting, and so I'd rather stay within the standards of governmental reporting than to try and do something different. It is set apart. There's an account for accrual, right? It's a single account. It is set apart as a separate account. You know, Shanna, if there's some way to present it so that Ron likes it better, I don't care.
No, don't worry about
I'm
me,
just
because
trying-
I just tune it out now.
If I can translate what I think I hear you say, Ron, bottom line is, does that level of understanding help us make better sense of how much we have available in reserves? If it's not necessary to that conversation, point taken. I agree with Chris, we can't just erase it, but what we can do is make sure that we are focused on the bottom line of what is available, and we don't have that precise number as a function of where we sit today. We will have a precise number as we work to reconcile what our operating expenditures and revenue will look like coming in from the October 1 count. So I think the point really was to reconnect to that prior conversation so
Right.
that it can help further the next steps of the conversation, which the most material piece of all of this is, with this dollar amount, what are our needs and how do we make some hard decisions as we're coming up upon making sure that we have a good understanding of where that dollar amount is coming from and how that can inform future decisions related to what's in front of us.
Can I ask a clarifying question? So we're talking about the accrued salaries and benefits line, correct?
Yeah, the orange line.
The orange line. Stan, I think where it's helpful, I concur. If I understand the reason that you're wanting to zero in on this is, for example, I've asked personally several times, what more can we do for our staff and our teachers? So if I'm looking at the bigger bucket, it's easy to say, okay, well, if we have this bucket, let's just put more here to make sure that we can take care of our staff, without recognizing and having to dig deeper and remember that's a reoccurring expense versus a bonus or an earned bonus for lack of better terms. So if I understand, you're saying that we spend a lot of time dialoguing about that, and if we're looking at it, if we pull it out, then it gives us a bigger, broader understanding of what we do have available versus what we don't, as far as salaries. Or did I just chase a bunny trail?
I was just trying to simplify our lives.
So if I may, because I think I was following the trail, there were some pieces I was picking up along the way. Think of it as really this graph, while we utilize it to help you understand exactly how the cash flow is a function of what we ultimately have in our reserves, you really don't need that orange line to make complete sense of that. We have created that so that you have every piece of the context available to you, but it doesn't change the bottom line of what we have available net in reserves. It just is, it creates a deceiving way of,
It's a net zero.
and if we follow that orange line, it is a bunny trail, right? And that really shouldn't be the way that we're basing what that final dollar amount is that's available. Because the one place I want to make sure that we're cautioning, and I think you hit on it, if we are talking about salaries and wages as being increased year over year sustainably, you're not doing that out of a reserve account.
Right,
You're doing that out of ongoing general fund dollars.
right.
If part of what you're asking is what would it look like to prioritize a bonus for staff at some point in this year, if you wanted to go there, then we would have to show exactly what's available and what amount makes the most sense to be able to do that. But we won't know that until we get closer into where we sit with October 1 count and our rolling budget procedure. So I think we're talking the same language on that.
Yep.
But again, coming back to the analysis of reserves, it's part of the bigger context, but you really don't need all of that information. And I think the other thing is we're getting good at it enough that we can not have to refer to the same slide that we created back in May, June to do this.
May I ask a clarifying question? At the beginning of the year and at the end of the year, the difference between the blue, which is cash and investments, and the gray, which is the fund balance, is the accrual.
The difference between the blue and the gray, is that what you're talking about?
Is the orange accrual.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I appreciated you adding that line because it helped me remember what the difference was between the blue and the gray. And it is that accrual.
Yes, that's correct. So, and that's why on the next slide, just trying to explain the difference between fund balance and cash reserves so that we can be using the same terminology and understanding when we are discussing things such as increasing wages versus bonuses, etc. Just because there might be $17 million in cash there does not mean $17 million in cash is currently available for anything, I guess. So, and that again goes back to the purpose of reserves being overall unexpected contingencies, supporting those cash flow changes throughout the year, as well as one-time expenditures versus ongoing expenditures, which you pointed out. So
I'd like to ask Ron this question. Would you, I mean, if they took that accrual graph out where it goes down for a couple months and then it builds itself back up over the course of the year, if we took that off, the difference between the blue and the gray will still be there, and it'll still identify for me what that accrual amount is at the beginning and the ending of the year. Or is your question really more along the lines of, is the accrual really an offset to our cash balance?
Actually, my question is probably more remedial than that. Is ultimately the reason the board or the public wants to know what we have in reserves is, are we dwindling it down? And how much of it do we need in the savings, and how much of it can be used to benefit the students, the staff, and the community? And where I'm trying to help us go and understand.
I need to understand what your purposes
please
are.
allow me to finish. Is if we reduce complexity on a chart, then we get ourselves more towards exactly what Shanna was talking about, which is there's a $17 million number up there, looks big and attractive, but it's not all available for use. And so therefore, in its simplest form, how much do we have in the bank? How much do we want to hold for things that can come up that we need to be prepared for? And how much is available to be leveraged in some form or fashion to the benefit of our students, staff, and constituents? That's all.
So we might want some language changes to purpose of reserves, because I think Ron has taken it beyond these 3 bullets. And do we want that as a board?
I think what I'm hearing is, so I appreciate the purpose of reserves because I think it's not just us that needs to understand that. Am I cutting out? There I go. Where it's helpful to understand is our role here is to make sure that we are being good stewards of our funds for our stakeholders and our students, and our ultimate goal is the education of our students. So making sure that we are prepared and ensuring that we have enough for unseen circumstances, but also not so much that we are saving up for retirement, which, so to speak, but that money that we're entrusted with is actually being used to the benefit of our students and our buildings and our staff and our district. So did I understand that correctly?
That's my rabbit trail.
Isn't as I understand the conversations, Ron is talking big picture, so that the purpose of these reserves, these 3 bullet points, are the more specific points of the umbrella of the reserve. So maybe there's just a different way to bulleted out. Not necessarily that we need additional bullets, but maybe some other graphic way of thinking about the reserves.
We just all need to be on the same page, I think.
Right.
That's all I'm trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can, just for a moment, restate the goal of this particular presentation was to, A, help you identify what is currently available or where do we have funding that is set into different accounts and what is that exactly. Phase B of this presentation will get to more of what our needs are as we are identifying deferred maintenance as the primary focal point of this presentation. Not to suggest that's our only category of need, but it's one that we think is important for you all to have that ability to understand. There's also a quick update here for you in terms of how we have used BEST grants. So I think it'll help push your conversation a little bit forward in terms of what these next slides will share.
Okay, so on the BEST grants, just to kind of go through the overall purpose behind those, just to refresh memories. Qualifying projects are those items related to safety hazards or health concerns. These include school facility security, incorporate technology into educational environment. This is the number one area that is awarded is safety hazards or health concerns. Another qualifying project would be to relieve overcrowding in school buildings, as well as provide career and technical education, capital construction and facilities. Again, if you go back and look at the BEST grants that are awarded annually, you're going to see safety hazards or health concerns awarded most of the time. Just so we're all on the same page with that. It is pretty narrow. Okay. So the funding model of the BEST grant is a matching grant, so we do have to put out funds in order for them to match to a percentage. And there is a criteria for calculating that matching percentage. It is not just a standard amount. The current projects that we have ongoing are Kilmer Elementary School, their boiler, and Prairie Winds Elementary School, their roof, which you will remember that the Prairie Winds Elementary School roof was in the building reserve projects for this year. So on this next slide is the minimum match criteria used to calculate that match. So you can read through those: assessed value per pupil relative to the state average, medium household income relative to the state average. So there's a bunch of different areas that are looked at in order to determine the percentage of match for a project. So the Kilmer Elementary School boiler, this project just finalized. The grant was closed out on August 31st. The total cost ended up being just shy of $204,000. 42% of that was paid by the BEST grant. We funded 58% of that. So I think it's important when we talk about BEST grants going forward that we understand we have to have a majority of the funding in order for that project to happen. So that's really important as we look at projects every time through the process. Prairie Winds Elementary School roof. This project is almost complete. The total cost as of August 31st that was incurred was almost $423,000, of which the school district funded 68.5%. So there will be some finalized things. Again, we like to make sure that we submit the proposal for the grant with an extreme, the absolute maximum cost that this could possibly be needed, because otherwise if something unexpected happens, the school district will incur 100% of that additional cost. So we always come in under budget. We have a great team that works on this, and they make sure we come in under budget every time, so that at least we are able to only have to pay the portion that is the school districts, and the grant funds the remaining portion. We are eligible to apply annually. The process that has been used is by us personally is that we go ahead and finish the current projects that we have ongoing with the BEST grants before we apply for a new grant. And so usually we're applying every other year instead of annually. The applications for the next cycle do open up in January of 2021. So we are currently meeting to discuss what projects, if any, would qualify for a BEST grant, so that if we have something that is needed, we can go after some funding there.
What is the likelihood of the state funding any BEST grants in this fiscal year?
That I don't know, but I do know that it's questionable.
I definitely think it's unknown at best right now. No pun intended there. And we'll get a better gauge as the legislative session begins to kick off in January.
And Shanna, when I've been to a couple BEST grant breakout sessions, but I'm still learning. So when the initial proposals go in, does the amount that our school district would commit to that project need to be specifically earmarked or set aside in any way? Or is that just once the proposal is granted?
That is a good question. I have not gotten into the details of how the BEST grant is applied for yet, so I don't know the answer to that, but I can get the answer to that.
Okay.
I know it's a pretty rigorous process to write up the grants and then do the presentation and the hearings before the BEST board. Some districts will will try to do the match via a bond or a mill levy they've been approved, but they can't get the funding from their side to finish the project. I think here in our own county, some of the school districts out east, 1 or 2 school districts out east is a prime example
where you can be left in limbo.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, they are left in limbo. My question would be, I have made this joke, not joke, but tongue in cheek, I guess, here in this very room, and it's something that school districts across the state that BEST grants are good for boilers and roofs. And when we I was looking at this where it says that that some of the projects that are looked at is things such as safety and security and health. That's the number 1 priority, but also to address overcrowding. Yet very few school districts seem to be able to get those grants. I think up in Weld County, up in Greeley, they were able to get a BEST grant to address that need, and it's also based on, I think, this slide right here, which the BEST grant minimum match criteria. I think that's a great slide because I think that slide shows how some districts qualify easier than others.
Correct. Yes.
My question is the bottom one, where I had not seen this before: bond election effort and success over the last 10 years. Can you speak to what does that mean?
They did not get into. I got this off of their website, and it does not get into exactly what that means.
Okay.
But I can do some more research and see if I can find out exactly what they mean by that. But I did find that one very interesting for us, for our school district specifically.
I remember when the BEST rep for our area came and we sat in the meeting room at Grace Best and asked, can a BEST grant be used for this particular building? And she shook her head. And I'm always curious look at one district over another that qualifies for one need over another, why we seem to be really good at fitting in that mold of boilers and roofs. And I guess my question, this might be more of a question for Ms. Wilcox, is what else have we applied for BEST besides boilers and roofs? We can find.
Well, and I will tell you, I met with Kathy Wilcox and talked through the BEST grant to get a better understanding, and her viewpoint is that because we pay her to write these and they're very extensive, she will tell us right off the bat if she does not believe that it is a proposal that will get approved and it's not worth our money to pay her to go through the whole process. So she really knows the ins and outs and will guide us in the right direction. So, which I totally appreciated from her because she wants to make sure that whatever money we're spending in order to receive a grant is in our best interest. So,
And she's very good at it, too.
yes, she is. So I think that's it on the best grant for now. And then I think Bob is going to go through deferred maintenance at this point.
Always a fun topic. So, deferred maintenance, those items, as you remember back in 2016, 2017, the district went through the RTA process. And with RTA doing a study, it identified a myriad of things that were deferred maintenance. Some of them would have been probably put into everyday, the category of everyday fixes. But what we have addressed through that is the PWES roof, the RKES boilers, the brick repointing of this building even. We went through and repointed the brick on this building. As you know, at 100 years old, it needed some help in spots. And then we have addressed some safety issues with that through our ongoing maintenance costs. We redid the entryway at Kilmer, Palmer Lake, and Lewis Palmer Middle School in the last couple of years. We've extensively redone those entryways. So that stuff we had already sort of addressed and ongoing. Sort of deferred maintenance that is addressed in annual repairs. You see stuff from various buildings, a deteriorated flashing cap, just your average, I say your average, your things that typically wear out, and a deteriorated asphalt. However, you'll see like deteriorated asphalt sort of builds its way into a cap when basically the parking lot has had too many repairs or needs to be redone. If you've driven through Lewis Palmer Middle School in the last couple weeks, you'll notice that that was extensively redone this summer because after 20-some years, 30-some years now, it has seen the end of its lifespan. Repairs that may become capital needs, you have aged carpet, and that, you have damage to the roofs. That is actual damage on Palmer Ridge's roof right now. And then deteriorated asphalt, that's the same thing. Like I said, sometimes you can patch them. Sometimes you need to redo the whole parking lot because you just can't patch the whole thing. Those may become capital needs when you're looking at something like Kilmer. The last guesstimate on Kilmer's parking lot was $150,000 because that has that extensive driveway out to it. We also have ADA compliance issues, which Shanna had talked about earlier. We have some non-compliant bathrooms, doorknobs, those things that over the years. The biggest issues right now is that we spoke to were some non-compliant ramps at Lewis Palmer High School and some issues out there in the fact that the school was designed and built in 1980, but we had never done an upgrade to the showers or benches in the locker rooms to make them anywhere near compliant. And as part of a CTE audit, they wanted us to bring a locker room up to compliance, a men's and women's locker room up to compliance in some manner. Whenever you start digging in a bathroom, as you know from your home experience, it becomes very expensive. Tile work is darn expensive.
Especially right now.
Yeah. So we have levels, sort of levels of this. We've tried to keep it pretty simple. Items that reached expected are high, expected to reach end of life by the scheduled date. Remediation repairs will not be a permanent fix. In other words, something we can put a Band-Aid on, but it is not going to heal the problem. And when I say failure would stop or greatly impede building operation, when we talk about in a minute a chiller tower going out or a boiler going out, that may result in a building closure. We had the chillers at Prairie Winds last year. You will remember the chiller tower was just a couple days before school, and that would have made school very difficult to run in that building had we not had a chiller. And that was just a waiting for the concrete to dry thing. Medium, we have safety compliance or ADA compliance issues. Repair can be made until replacement. Afforded an example of this one would be our chiller has moved from medium. Our chiller at Lewis Palmer High School has moved from medium to high. We fixed it. The fix should last 2 years. We're in year 1 of that. If the chiller at Lewis Palmer High School goes out, that may be something that closes school. Not all of our buildings can you open windows anymore for safety reasons. Not all of our buildings can you open the doors and let the air in for safety reasons. It just doesn't make sense. You know, that's a safety concern. The low areas can be prolonged with repairs until monies are available. We can do things to make those continue on. Carpet tends to be something in deferred maintenance that we leave for a long time because it doesn't become an immediate trip fall hazard or something like that. Ron.
A couple of things on this. First of all, thank you for providing some of this comprehensive and absorbable. Secondly, when we think about the expense of ongoing maintenance, especially in facilities that are aging,
Yes.
is there a philosophy, a rule of thumb, or a business practice where we look at some kind of a tipping point and say, this, we are throwing more good money after bad, we are better off on a 5 or 10-year analysis in investing the capital and replacing, buying new, whatever the right term is?
Tipping point, for example, with the Lewis Palmer High School chillers is that the parts are becoming increasingly hard, if not impossible, to find. Tipping point for the chillers at Bear Creek is that we have repaired and we have a contract with to come in and do preventative maintenance on them on an annual basis. And when those annual checks, when the guy from Longs comes in and goes, you know, they're 20-some years old, you need to start thinking about what you're going to do when these fail. So when your guys who are the experts in the machine look at it and go, it's time to start thinking about replacing these, then you have some time span of 2 or 3 years there to look at it, to investigate what you're going to need. The Lewis Palmer Middle School boiler is another one of those things that is coming up on end of life. Lewis Palmer Middle School was put into operation in 93, 94. That boiler is getting upwards of, I hate to say it, 30 years old now, you know. And, you know, I hate to say it because I've been there with it. So
Yeah, me too.
it's
That's
starting
sad
to
state of
starting to
affairs,
show
isn't
its
it?
age, you know, and those repairs needed to be made. This summer, Prairie wins the water supply for that. As you know, last year we had a problem with that we tracked down to an incorrect installation 20 years ago. That incorrect installation 20 years ago led to the pump being bad this year probably because that pump had been running way too much with the leaks that it had. So we did that. We also did some upgrades to the system that hopefully will make the new pump last a lot longer. You know, filtration and things like that and cleaning of the cistern out there. That'll make that last a lot longer. So a whole list of, I probably went off what you wanted specifically, but sort of a checklist, and Danny and his guys are really good at predicting this has had enough, it needs to go.
Thank you.
Yep.
Something that would be a value of me, and I don't know if the rest of my board members would feel this way or not, being able to have a priority list of some things you mentioned we put a Band-Aid on.
Mm-hmm.
Funds, for example, makes that necessary, but there might be some things that really we just need to do the upfront costs. It may be more expensive, like asphalt versus concrete. That's something I hear from Ricky all the time in our parking lots. So is there a point where just going ahead and putting the money up front to have it more sustainable versus what we really have to Band-Aid fix because we just don't have the funding? Is there a breakdown of that? You don't. So
The breakdown would actually be in the suggested projects here, in that the
Okay.
ones that have matriculated up to it's time to fix it, it's time to replace it, the chillers, the boiler, those things. Ricky would love to replace every parking lot this year. but he may get 1 in 2 years. So parking lots also in consideration of that is what is the effect of that item breaking or being beyond service life. When it comes to chillers and boilers, you shut a building down, you stop education because of those things.
Sure.
Parking lots, it's harder to say you're going to stop education because of the potholes in the parking lot, but it does become a point like with Lewis Palmer Middle Schools where you cannot fix those anymore. So you start to think of, that's at the end of life. When are we going to fix it? Kilmer's is the next parking lot. I think on Ricky's list, Kilmer would be the next one up. The concrete repairs for Ricky, it's all comes down to trip and fall with him, and what's going to be a hazard to people walking. You'll notice that we did a few repairs around Bear Creek this summer. At the very end of the summer, we did those. That's what happens when we get as much heat and thaw cycle, and we end up having to replace those. So we're sort of always chasing bad concrete with that, and then when we get to a point where we don't have as much bad concrete to repair, then we consider improvements to site improvements.
Where are we at Lewis Palmer High School? And there's some of their potholes.
That's probably $250,000. So we'll be repairing that probably
Gotcha.
for a little while. That's a huge parking lot.
So,
Yeah, we can offset some of that with parking fees, but $80 a parking fee doesn't pay for
$25 million.
repair, tear out and repair of that.
25,000, yeah, 250,000.
so most of these decisions are dependent on evaluation and variables from the experts and professionals in our district who are out there working with.
Ricky and Danny, who deal
Yeah.
with it every day, yeah.
Totally understood. The ADA compliance issues, are they under a mandated timeline of some sort?
Yes.
Oh, good question.
We were inspected as an agency that receives the career and technical education funding. We came under the auspices of the Community College Review, and they needed to review Lewis Palmer High School. When they reviewed Lewis Palmer High School, that's where those ADA compliance issues were brought up. We argued many of those issues with them with a 40-year-old wing of the building. That was pre-ADA. We came down to a list of items that we have to fix, that we agreed to a 3-year timeline. As part of that process, COVID may push that timeline out a little bit, but the two big items left in that are the ramp up front and the locker rooms.
And
Okay,
these
so-
are on subsequent slides if you want to move
Yes,
forward.
those are in subsequent slides, yeah. Yep. So, recommended deferred maintenance for this coming year is the chillers and the boilers and the BCS controllers. You'll notice BCS controllers is on there multiple years. That's $40K per wing when it comes to Bear
Well,
Creek Elementary
Bob,
School.
you said for this year, but when I read those, it says next
21,
year, the year
next
after, and the
year.
year
Yeah,
after.
sorry,
That's
next
3
year.
years out.
Yeah,
This is
we just-
great. I like to see it this way. It's not
Yeah,
this year.
sorry, I misspoke on that. It is 3 years. That is next year's. 22-23, the LPMS boilers are on there again at $300K. Actually, I think we had moved the boilers out. 22-23 would probably be the more accurate year for those. I think we may be able to track down a BEST grant for that too. That would be my hope, would be to get those on a BEST grant. And then the PRHS.
So Bob, sorry to interrupt. To be clear, it's a one-time cost.
It's a
not-
one-time cost.
Okay. So we could
Oh.
either do it
We could
21,
either do it
22 or
21,
22,
22 or
23.
22, 23.
Okay.
Danny's thinking he can get to 22, 23 with where they are now.
At a total cost of $300,000.
At a
not
total cost
600.
of 300,000.
At the middle school.
Looking at 900K for those chillers, those are expensive. That's going to be a lot. But Bear Creek, you'll notice, is spread out over. That will actually be the third and final year in 22, 23 of repairing them. We repaired some already this year. We've done a wing at a time in that building to try to update those controllers. Again, they're 20 years old.
Bob, I hate to do this, but
Yeah.
we've got quite a bit more on our agenda,
Yeah,
and
you
we're
bet.
going long. So
Yep.
if you could work through the medium, and then I want to talk about deferred maintenance and what your overall picture looks like and how the board could maybe address this.
The overall picture is that we need a consistent cash flow into the fund. As you can see, this is not inclusive of everything that will break or become apparent that it needs to be replaced.
Which raises the question, does the next slide of
Yeah,
3.1 million, is that everything? Because I added up the numbers, and you're right, it's not everything.
it's not everything. No, that is as we currently understand it and as we currently know it.
What about the 3.1? Is that everything?
That is everything as of today.
As of what you know
Ask me
today?
tomorrow and
Based
I'll
on your
find out.
estimates and,
Yeah,
and
based
your
on
work?
the estimates of today, yes.
Is that 4 years?
4 to 5.
So it's less than $1 million a year?
Less than $1 million a year, with some years being more because the
No,
chillers,
timing.
chillers would be more.
But let me
average-
ask a question of Shanna then. Do you know approximately how much does this school district spend on this deferred maintenance every year? Because we've already talked about those things that we have addressed in the past, like the entranceways, et cetera, right? Do you know about how much we spend a year in this area?
I don't have that number, no. I think part of the point is that we keep putting it off so that we don't
Well, except
spend
what
it
we
every
have
year.
to do, right? We do what's emergencies.
Correct.
Correct. And what has been the practice up till now, instead of committing many times, what you'll see is Ricky and Danny doing a lot of work over summer. We have taken that deferred maintenance, which has been a little over $1 million, of 1.5 right in there per year. And at the very end of the year, what happens is there's a meeting with Danny and Ricky, and I happened to be in on it last year for the first time. And it was like, okay, we need X amount to balance the budget elsewhere. So really you have this much to work with. Fix what you can for that.
You
Which
spend
is-
it or lose it. I got it. So here's the question I want to ask the board to consider. What's our total budget expenditure? Is it 50 million? Or what?
In that range,
Let's
yeah.
just use that as a round number. So we have a $50 million a year expenditure budget. If we did 2%, that's $1 million a year. Committed to this deferred maintenance bucket, if you will. And we let the school district manage it based on their needs. Now, is 2% the right number is where I'm wanting to go with this.
Are you saying move 2% of that 50 million to address deferred maintenance, meaning cut?
Well, that's why I ask you the question, what have we done historically? Because I'm not talking about moving anything. I'm talking about the pie. We have a pie.
Right.
There's only so much money.
Mm-hmm.
So based on that amount of money available, is 2% the right level of spending to address deferred maintenance over time? That's what I would like us to look at and conclude. And then year to year, it might be a little different based on the details. But isn't that what we want to understand, is how much of the total expenditures are being addressed to what is a serious problem, and it's more serious over time if we do nothing. Ron?
2 quick questions. Several slides ago, you threw up a slide that $1.2 million was set aside for capital maintenance improvements in Fund 43, if I got that one right.
Yep.
The sum total of the fiscal 21-22 needs, ironically, is $1.2 million. Do those correlate?
No.
Different years, I
Yeah,
think.
you're talking different years. So this is what we're looking at for 2021, whereas what you are talking about is 21-22 projections.
Okay, but
And so when you
but-
talk about $1 million a year to catch up maybe on deferred maintenance, if that's what I'm understanding, you're saying,
Well, that's what this slide suggests. The deferred maintenance slide suggests that it's 3 million over 4 years, or 5. I mean, if you want to make it less. But I said 1% of 50 million is 500,000. So $1 million a year is roughly 2% of your budget, your overall
and it looks like
expenditures.
my point is, it looks like this year is pretty close to 2%,
Right.
give or take an emergency.
yeah, so to fund this, 884,000 is coming out of the general fund out of that 50 million. to help fund
And Ron,
these projects.
to add to your point then is historically, I don't know what we've spent, but this year, you're right on. It's about 2%.
And it looks like next year, before we add in, like Bob said, what we don't know yet, we're
It could be
pretty close to that
2%.
number again.
Yep.
So this is highly logical, at least based on history, and maybe more important than logic and history is what's functional, Casey, for your staff to get ahead of the curve instead of playing catch up. And the example I keep thinking of is the dramatic meeting we had about buses several months ago, and we cut back. And I remember Bob saying, we have kicked this can down the road year after year after year, and there's only so much duct tape and baling wire can do. And we probably bought several buses with all the maintenance we've done. And so obviously the question becomes, there's no buses in here. Maybe that's because it's leasing versus capital. But my point is, if we give you the tools to be successful, which is what Chris is recommending, and I wholeheartedly concur, can we reduce the amount of diving catches we need to do so that more of what you guys and your teams are doing is daily course of business versus fire drills?
And Ron, go ahead, Matt.
You know, I like what everyone is saying, and I agree with you 100%. But traditionally, the board has always set goals for these types of deferred maintenance. We always have, but there's a balance between compensation for employees and deferred maintenance. And a lot of times, ideas and items that we've identified for deferred maintenance, if it meant going forward with those, would mean that we wouldn't be able to take care of our employees. So, you know, I support the 2% or whatever figure that we come up with, but I just want to make sure this board is aware that we've been down this road, and when times are tough, we're always going to have to look at these capital improvements versus the compensation that we provide for our team.
Excellent point, because we have limited resources with unlimited opportunities. In fact, I saw a presentation where there's 50 million in deferred maintenance in our school district. 50 million. And we were going to go out for a bond for 90 million or something along those lines to fix everything. And that just didn't work and probably won't work. At the same time, if the chiller goes out, the people who we want to compensate can't go to work, right? I mean, there are trade-offs here. And I don't have the answer to all those trade-offs. That's what Casey and team have to do. My idea around deferred maintenance is if indeed it's 50 million and we're allocating $1 million a year, it'll only take us 50 years to get caught up. By then, we'll have new issues, right? So I don't say that 2%. I did not mean to suggest I am proposing 2%. I was only using that for the discussion. But I do believe that out of our pool of resources, we have to address deferred maintenance. And I think everybody has to understand when we get to a budgeting process, I would much rather have a discussion that Matt just raised about, okay, well, what's the right amount in these various areas? Because they're all trade-offs. And those are hard. I think Casey just said it a few minutes ago, just on deferred maintenance. We've got some tough choices to make down the road here, right? So my idea is, do you guys want to understand everything about chillers and boilers and roofs? Or do you want to look at the big picture and just say, what are we committing to address deferred maintenance? My feeling is we have to address it every year. We're way behind. Now, how do we catch up? Well, 2% is not going to catch us up. I don't know what the right number is. You guys can come up with it, right? I don't know what it is. But I would much rather us look at a budgeting process where we look at the big rocks, salaries and benefits, deferred maintenance, operating costs, transportation. I mean, there's only a handful of them because 75% of it's compensation. What I'd like us to do is make sure that we never ignore deferred maintenance as a line item in our budgeting process, because will only get worse. That's my thoughts.
And I agree with your assessment, but with that being said, once again, it's going to be a balancing act when we come to the table and we figure out what we're going to do for our teachers and staff and the benefit packages.
Understood.
One other thing we might consider in this context is when you get to 80% of your revenues being consumed by reoccurring fixed costs, which in this case would be employee compensation, you get to the point to where you lose a lot of agility and capacity to do the things that Bob's been struggling with for far too long. If we go down a path of having an organized plan, in fact, I had this conversation with a set of community members on Thursday afternoon, I think we'll show the community that we have our fiscal house in order, and we'll re-earn the credibility we need to ask them to reinvest. And this particular group of self-espoused, highly conservative individuals said we would be happy to reinvest in the school system if we were confident that they had their fiscal house in order. So by doing these things, I think we take a significant step towards that end. And we live in a community that reveres education. And to Matt's point, we're never going to save our way into paying our teachers what they likely are worth and should be paid, given that we're already at 75 cents on the dollar anyways. But if we have our fiscal house in a credible position and show them what's going to happen in the next 5 years, and that would probably put us in position in 6 or 12 or 18 months to go back to the community and say, do you think it's time? And that will solve the problem, because salaries are a reoccurring expense and capital is periodical.
Any other thoughts or questions on this subject? I want to thank you for the presentation, because you did look out 3 to 4 years. That's kind of one of the first times I've seen this, where we've really looked out and said, well, over this period of time, this is what we see as being high priority or medium priority. So I thank you very much for this presentation and the forward-looking aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
And Casey, I think as a board, we like this approach. It would be good to have you do the analysis with your team of what is the percentage of that total pie that really should be addressing deferred maintenance.
We're on it.
Thank
I'll
you.
call it
everyone.
our level 2 analysis, pending.
I know this was
Thank
a
you
long
very
discussion.
much.
It was a good discussion.
Let's take a quick
Thank you. This was a good
5-minute break.
discussion.
So we'll be here at 11:12. We'll start up. Okay, thank you very much. The next item on our work session is forging community relationships that Dr. Summers will facilitate a presentation and a discussion.
Okay, so every board member should have next to their agenda a one-page document, but it's double-sided. At the top, we have an initial frame of building community relationships and fostering effective communication. And specifically today, we're just going to spend a little bit of time delving into this topic under the umbrella of equity. So what I wanted to call out is, even though this particular goal is represented by Goal 5 in our strategic plan, it probably ties multiple goals and priorities together, and specifically when we're looking at the cultivation of equitable, diverse, and a culturally responsive learning environment. I just wanted to give the board an update on where we situate with respect to that work. Obviously, there's been quite a bit happening since the summer and into the beginning of the year in terms of asking our district and asking our board, what are we doing about this? So I just thought we'd walk through this somewhat briskly together. We could probably spend an entire day on this topic and still have a lot more to go. So I don't mean to minimize the importance of what we have in front of us, but I just wanted to give you some opening frames to really set this work up. It starts with our core values, and I just highlighted a few here. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list. But when we think about how every student deserves access to an education system grounded in equitable practice, we must be willing to examine our system of education closely to understand where we currently have both equitable and potentially inequitable practices at work. And I just thought I'd summarize this under that third bullet, particularly from a district and board leadership perspective. I'd really like us to make sure that we're willing to listen, first and foremost, to learn. And from that listening and learning, I think that will be what will prepare us to lead. So a lot is made about equity and educational equity in particular. If you look at that first bullet as a definition, educational equity means that each child receives what they need to develop to their full academic and social potential. Wow, that sounds really great and really straightforward. But I think we also have to note that involves, in that second bullet, every student having access to the resources and educational rigor they need at the right moment in their education. And you see, irrespective of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, language, disability, family background, family income, citizenship, or tribal status. Both of these definitions are taken from resources that are linked. So in your board agenda, you can actually go to those websites. There's additional resources that are listed lower in the page. And for anyone that's tuning in right now, this resource page will be made public at the conclusion of this meeting. And I just wanted to walk through us together first before we just opened all that up. The other thing I'd like to touch on is just a framework or a starting point to think about priorities within this work. I'm not going to read each description of these to you, but you see 4 priorities that are highlighted or bolded under this framework, starting with student experiences and outcomes. I do want to take a moment and spell out within those student experiences and outcomes, we know from the research that a young person's academic, social, and emotional development are all linked. I think sometimes we refer to academic learning or social emotional learning, and one of the concepts that I want to make sure that we're leaning into here is they're not necessarily separated out, that we're thinking about this holistically. We're thinking about this with whole child supports in mind. And number 2, the quality of a child's learning environment, their experiences and access to opportunity can shape and determine their developmental and academic outcomes. You see a few of the others in terms of educators, parents, and leaders, the role that we all play, how we think about organizational structures and conditions, and how we also get to the root of policy and advocacy in terms of understanding how our policies are at work and where they may be supporting equity or where they may be reproducing inequitable practices. If you flip the page,
Casey, before you leave that
Oh, please.
area, because that framework of priorities is, in some ways, you're fleshing out our big rock number 5.
yes,
And for example, even in the title here, it says building community relationships.
yes,
My first thought of community is people who live in the community, and I think what you're suggesting the community means is everybody affected by the school system, including the children and the students and the teachers and the staff and the parents.
correct.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
Yep. There's a great mental model or visual graphic that helps shape this in a little bit more detail. I don't have it pulled up for you right now, but this, again, is just meant to introduce some of the different foundational elements as it pertains to this concept. So how do we take all this great starting point of information and sort of big picture thinking and start thinking about some next steps? So if you turn the page, at this point in time, I think the best way to really position our work as it pertains to this big topic is, and it's summarized first in bold there, providing rich opportunities to learn, and start by re-engaging, listening to, and building relationships with our students and our families. So specifically, what we're looking at doing is designing and implementing, and I use this term somewhat loosely right now, but it's important to narrow the focus down, listening sessions. With what intent? To listen really to the stories and the lived experiences, starting with our students, our families, and our staff relating to issues of equity. So I think what we're talking about there are the potential of small groups of students. Perhaps that's just a student listening session. Perhaps we also look at students alongside parents or perhaps families. I think our alumni have a lot that they can share with us in this process, and certainly educators and staff. Notably missing from this list, and it's not to imply at all that community members do not have a voice in this, it's just to say for us to be able to manage this well, I think we want to start as close to the student experience as we possibly can and really prioritize those student and family experiences as one set of folks that are engaged in what these listening sessions would hope to accomplish. Let me keep moving through this outline here. So listening sessions can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. If you go back to what we started in January, February, with community collaboration conversations, as we remember, that was a very open-ended, very broad target audience. It could be anybody and everybody that would come in at any given point in time and share their opinions. With the sensitivity of topics, however, that could be addressed within these listening sessions, I think it's really important for us to make sure that we are prioritizing a safe and structured constructivist learning environment. What do we mean by that? So the starting point is I do think we're going to have to be limited in how big of an audience we can do this with. If we're looking at focus groups, for example, we would be looking at smaller groups of individuals. So initially anywhere from 8 to 12. It may go a little bit more. It could be a little bit less depending on the situation. Very important that we are creating ground rules, norms, and striving for confidentiality in this process. Making sure that the facilitator of the conversation has been trained and is extremely aware of how to best facilitate this type of discussion. And really calling out what I would suggest to the board is the role, as well as any district or school leaders who might be included in these sessions, is being intentionally a listener and an observer. I think there's a lot of power in making sure that right now our stance is, again, informed by making sure that we're asking good questions and that we're listening intently to those responses. As a starting point for the goals, I think we're looking at twofold, but it could be broadened out to include others. But starting with an increase of awareness of equity issues and enhancing participants' ability to understand and examine those issues critically. And then also using this as a platform to inform our system about current strengths and areas for improvement. Now, I say that it's not probably a learning session or listening session that starts with, tell us about our current system and the strengths and areas for improvement. It would be more along the lines of, can you talk about an experience that you've had in school that has made you to feel a sense of belonging or a sense of inclusion? It's a very open-ended question. We would allow respondents or participants to respond to that type of question with us just listening to what are their stories, what are the lived experiences that are coming from that dynamic of when I felt like I've belonged or when I have felt included in school. A follow-up question to that might be, can you talk about a time when you did not feel included? Can you tell us about a time where maybe you did not feel like you belonged? Notice that even just the question itself, again, very open-ended, very high level, is not trying to seek a specific answer from somebody. It's not trying to identify a perpetrator, if you will, or a victim on the other hand of that. It's a very, tell us when you felt like you have belonged in school, tell us about a time when you maybe have not, right? There's other types of questions that we can ask that can really get to the core of what those lived experiences are. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that there is experiences that either students or families have experienced that they are just trying to get out, and they're trying to say, you need to know A, B, C, D things that have taken place. And there's an appropriate way for us to collect that information as well. In that share out, right, it's really important that the listening audience and any of the participants that are involved are coming from a place of, we're not judging what's right or what's wrong about that experience. We're not saying, here's why you're feeling the way that you felt, and here's what that means as a result. We are going to stay very low on what I refer to as the ladder of inference. Therefore, we're not trying to infer more than what the lived experience of the participants who are engaged in this process are telling us. There may be a follow-up question that says, what could have made that situation better for you? Or what could have been done that you would like to see us really make sure that our system is aware of as we're going forward, right? So, again, the point being that we're walking out less with a specific set of, here's everything that happened, here's everything that was done or that was not done, and here's now what our system has to do. Part of what we're going to have to make sense of is, because of the complexity of what is being shared and how challenging this topic, this big thing that we're referring to, equity, encompasses, is it's just merely a first step in the process that allows for a deeper level of awareness. As we identify awareness as that initial starting point, what allows us to build on that next step, whether it's capacity building or whether it's more of the actions that are going to correspond to what specific training or elements of our next steps in this equity work have to be, we're allowing this listening group of listening sessions to really inform how those next steps play themselves out. So in other words, we don't have a predetermined outcome, but at the same time, we're going to allow the content or the quality of what we're receiving to really help ultimately summarize where we might begin to go next. So there's where you see the timeline. This would be really the primary focus. This is not meant to be the end-all be-all, but it's meant to be that first step in the process, leading toward a detailed summary with a beginning list of recommendations for additional consideration. We would identify an initial time frame of that to be late December, early January. So that's a lot around the listening sessions. Just one more point underneath that in terms of leadership training and support. Something that I would propose to the board as a possibility is to think about a retreat, perhaps sometime during this first semester. One consideration could be to bring in what I'm referring to here as an equity consultant, or somebody who is trained around equity work, specifically around how we're aware of bias and what role that plays in our organization, as well as in our role as leaders. The other thing I want to call out so that you are aware is that our K through 12 leadership team, so that includes district executive leadership team, principals, assistant principals, deans, instructional coaches, learning services team. It's a group of about 45 of us in the district. We are going to be, as part of our leadership training and work together, beginning this October and working through the year, we're going to actually engage in a module that is around disrupting inequity. And the foundation of that is around being able to have brave conversations about bias. I would love if any of you have the time and interest to invite you in as also being part of those leadership training days, because I think it would give you a good sense of where we see currently, at least at a leadership level, where we're at in our in the next steps in the trajectory of our work. At this time, that is currently the focus in terms of staff training. So we have not gone so far as to say, here's what we're going to train all of our teachers on, and here's how we're going to do training across every school. We're just not at that point yet, but at least a district leadership K through 12 continuum, that's what we have in front of us. Lastly, there's some additional resources, again, links that you might find very beneficial to you as you are becoming more familiar and aware of different resources relating to building equitable learning environments. So that's a lot of where this has come from, not just my own mind, I promise. But it's exciting work, it's challenging work, and I would say one more thing and then certainly open it up to any questions or discussion. This will be challenging. This is very challenging work. In fact, conversation that we're having earlier today in our leadership team, if it's not difficult, if it's not pushing us, we're not doing it right. Okay? So I just say that because it's really important for us to maintain an atmosphere of civility and respect. In fact, that's extremely crucial for me, is making sure that we are not just walking into this blindly or with a naivete that will say, oh, we'll just have a conversation about equity and expect that that's going to make the difference. It's going to push us, and it will push our system. But I think when we're getting back to the core of what we're really trying to cultivate for each and every one of our students, I can say this, based on what I've heard and seen thus far, our kids are thirsty for this. Our staff are thirsty for this. We have parents that are, and families that are really invested in how they can be part of this solution. So the time is ripe for us to be able to lean in, listen, learn, and lead. And with that, any questions or further discussion?
I have one. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
It may be early for this question. If we do this well, and it's likely an iterative process that maybe takes 2 to 6 semesters to get ingrained into the DNA of the district, what do the students get?
That is a real big question, real important question. And if I might reframe it to what does every student receive? And the reason I point that out is I think it's really important for our system to acknowledge where every student resides in this continuum, because the reality is if we deal with it from what all the students are going to get, that implies to some extent that we can ensure that we're delivering something that really is fundamentally positioned to focus on every student, and not only their access to those resources, but the rigor that they need at the right moment in their education. So how I'll build off of that is they are receiving and they are participating in a system where they have empowerment, they have voice and choice, they have supports as well as opportunities that allow them to realize their fullest potential based on where they situate K through 12 and where they're positioned to be able to go into the real world. If we take that real world conversation a step further, they're ready, right? They can go anywhere and interact with anyone and have confidence, have compassion, have capacity to feel a sense of how they're participating as an active member of society and not being immune or unaware to what the real intricacies of living in the 21st century and what that means for them and what that means for the community that they serve. So I kind of went on a different path there, but it still gets to that core result, which is they are ready for future life success. They are ready for college and career in a challenging environment that is going to enable them to be participants and leaders as they're forging that road into the future.
So would it be fair to say it enhances their tool bag of tools with which to be successful?
Absolutely, and I'll go a step further on that. There will be bottom line outcomes, right? I think something that's important for us to begin to unpack, in addition to listening and understanding the stories, is what does our data tell us about students who may be coming with a particular advantage or disadvantage into a learning environment. So let me go a little bit granular for a moment. One of the things that is really important for us is to understand where there may be academic achievement gaps, right? If we're really focused on making sure that there are gaps that we are working to understand, am I good? What we should be able to see are outcomes that begin to shorten that gap or minimize the gap from existing. Now, how might that appear? Well, I'm going to just pick one off the top of my head. You have a greater percentage of male students who are currently accessing and performing at a high level in terms of our higher level math, science, engineering type courses. We should ideally be able to see very little difference between a male and a female gap when it comes to accessing courses and performance in those related courses, right? And you can translate that down into just about any disaggregated group and being able to see and understand, well, why is this data point looking the way that it's looking? Let us use these equity conversations to be able to better enable our system to be aware of some dynamics that we may not even be that aware of, or we're not going and intending to create those types of gaps, but where do we see those exist, and how do we unpack those to be able to get to a place where we understand what are the actions that we're taking that are either consistent with that or are disrupting the inequity that we seek to identify and then unpack from there. So again, that's just one example, and there's a lot more that we could delve deeper into. Gaps between students who are identified as an English language learner and students that are not. Are we seeing English language learner students be able to pursue as rigorous a coursework as a English-speaking student? That's another great vantage point. When we look at discipline, are we seeing disproportionality of discipline data that may represent inequities toward a particular target group? What's underneath that? Why is that the case? And how do we unpack that from there? But everything that I'm bringing to you just as those examples, also I would illustrate as that is an educational leadership mindset that also has bias built into it, right? Because what I'm suggesting in those things is there may be something that we control or we maybe don't control. Is my bias such that what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to identify a target group that is disadvantaged in the way that they're looking at it? Well, even claiming that to be disadvantaged could be my bias that's coming through in that, right? So how can I make sure that I'm super aware of how that bias is being acknowledged and checked? And part of that is making sure that we are creating safe and structured dialogue that can really get to the core of, well, why are some of those issues what they really are? It shouldn't be me that's figuring that out on behalf of a student or on behalf of a family. It should be us asking to inquire so that we can utilize that feedback as the impetus toward what our next steps become. You can tell I get a little passionate about it, but I hope I'm not going too far off track. So if that didn't answer your question, I can answer it another way or any others that may be there.
No, fine, thank you.
Well, I can only speak from the Taylor tribe, and you know, I've always believed that that the education system is to help support parents in the raising, nurturing of their children, and I think this addresses this in a way that my tribe and our biases will be okay. Is that part of what equity is allowing every tribe to excel in the system, regardless of our bias that we all have as a tribe?
If I'm understanding correctly, is part of equity supporting the family's ability to understand,
To access
To
to equity with that, regardless of our bias. Because we talk about irrespective of all these things, but we didn't say irrespective of bias, which is somewhat built into some of those that we've mentioned, right? Ethnicity or gender, or, I mean, there's a different bias. My wife and I have different biases, and it's okay. But the reality is irrespective of all of those things you've listed, inherent in that is our bias.
Yes. So I think it can be both. If I can build off of that mindset, it's not disregarding the fact that there will inevitably be bias that is entering into the equation. Our ability as a system to ensure that the success of each child is not predicated upon the specific group that they may be coming from is really what we're after. It's making sure that that's not a predictor of how that student is going to show up and perform in an educational environment.
And hence, later, where you're talking about training and being able to have these conversations about bias.
Correct.
Because everybody's, I bet you we have different biases right here.
Yes.
Very different biases. But it's okay. In fact, that's part of diversity and celebrating diversity. Is
Yes.
learning to understand what those biases are, acknowledging them, respecting them, and moving forward. And so I think it kind of ties back into your training
Yes.
suggestion of how do you deal with that? Because I think at its core, that's where the inequity starts.
Yes, you said that extremely well. So I do think that would create a level of awareness of the role that bias plays, because it's almost to make an argument that we're striving for no bias, that's the wrong goal to have. Bias will exist no matter what the situation is. It's how do we check those biases in such a way that we can enable a system that is predicated upon every student's success to be the guide that's going to help us get there. And to be able to recognize and become more aware of where our own bias situates is a critical step in that process, because what it ultimately leads to is there is right and wrong, but everyone has different opinions or interpretations of what that actually means and how it shows up. So as educators especially, and as leaders within the system, I think our ability to call those fundamentals out and to be able to say what's truly examples of equity in work, right? Because the other thing is not just what our words are, but really what our actions say behind those is what's going to enable us to make the path more workable or walkable, if you will, in that we're not just asking people to clear their own path toward what the realization of equity actually is, that we play a critical role in making a pathway that allows people to walk on what is District 38 doing to promote and ensure equity in every place that we possibly can? It's being able to, like I said earlier, start by saying, here is what it is, here is also what it isn't, and are we willing to call it out when we're not doing something that's consistent with what we're creating? And if that's the case, in a healthy system, we can identify that, we can get to the source of where that inequity exists. And a lot of times it's a combination of mindset, skill set, and a tool set. Do we have the right tools available? Do we have skills and strategies that we've supported people in being able to implement? And also, do I have a willingness or an attitude that allows me to want to be part of that solution? I think if we were to break that down a little bit further, that's a good conversation to have with our staff, right? Where are we succeeding as a system right now? Where are we falling short? Or for a teacher, what makes the job doable within your classroom when we're asking you to do all this work around equity? What makes it difficult? What barriers may be at play? So again, thinking through what those questions become so that what we're really striving for is a deeper appreciation and understanding, because we could go into these listening sessions and just, like I say, already have a pre-established agenda and walk out and say, well, here's already what we know we're going to do. And that's why I'm really stressing that we have to be constructivist in the way that we're creating this together, because we have to make sure that we're doing a really good job at diagnosing and understanding what the dimensions of this issue are that are currently at play. And as many different people as we talk to are going to be as many different perspectives on this issue. So one of the other concerns that I have in this right now is whoever we're able to engage between now and the end of this semester is just the starting point for those conversations to occur. At its best, what I think we could actually see happening are conversations that aren't necessarily formal in nature, but become even more part of the DNA, as we like to say, of what's at work in our district each and every day. My thought is you can go into any classroom at any given time and see or hear evidence of equity at work. And where you see equity in one place, you may also see inequity working simultaneously, whether we're aware of it or not. So all we're really trying to do is identify that and unpack that in ways that make it more actionable for our system. So it's, again, it's exciting, but it's also really challenging. And it gets to the core of what a lot of people are feeling. This is very deeply emotional work as well. So we just have to be very thoughtful about how we're setting up parameters that enable safety, respect, structure to help guide what that work leads itself to. And again, be able to lean into what people's lived experiences are to tap into that rich collective knowledge to utilize it as our next steps.
Like Ron said, it's over time. In fact, if it becomes part of the DNA, it becomes forever, right? I mean, in theory, that would be nice. One of the issues I have around this whole subject, personally, is, do I dare share my bias with you? What's the consequence of me being open? Because there's risk. There's always risk. And that's why we have the need for this. Is because sometimes people will be open, share something that's heartfelt, and it gets used against them. And that's a hard thing, and that's why I like your approach of listening, safe environments. But at its core, I mean, I remember being a kid. I know that may be hard for you to believe, but I do remember my elementary years, and I remember being a bully, and I remember being bullied. Mm. And so it's not new. It's been around. And this approach, what you're doing is, I think, the ultimate goal here is to change the DNA of our system to eliminate the fear that you can't share your bias, your differences, your diversity. And I guarantee you, every one of us have a different perspective. So that's a a big mountain you've laid out. If I could, the cultivate equitable, diverse, culturally responsive learning environments is under big rock number 2. And yet this is all being under big rock number 5, communications and building relationships. I find that interesting, but it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? That just as dealing with resources affects all the areas, right? You have to pay for the rent, etc., or the teachers, etc. But in this case, I think this is really interesting that Casey's chosen to present this as a big rock number 5 with a focus on one of the key points of the environment, which is number 2. What do you guys think about that? Is it make sense to you?
So I can speak to that one because I actually brought that up to Casey in when we were in our break, that this speaks to big rock number 2, and the reason that it really touches me is, Ron, you asked a very good question when you said, what are the students receiving? And you touched on a very important aspect of that our differences and our diversity and perspectives adds to the goal of reaching and teaching each child as an individual in a safe environment that allows them to reach their full potential. And tolerance of diversity and perspective is a key part of this too. And when we talk about our rock number 1, when I think of educational programming, it's not curriculum. Curriculum's a part of it, but it's what is our goal when our children walk out of our halls? When we're reaching and teaching and they're growing into adults and advocating for themselves, what does that look like? And what does a top-notch education and a successful school district, what does that look like? And I think that this speaks to that. And I think I like the listening in a safe way is important. I think we have to lean in, and that's how we grow, and that's how we become better, instead of resting on our laurels. I have my own biases. Obviously, my bias, I'm always advocating for what are we doing best for our special needs population of students. And that's in my heart. And it made me think of, I'm just going to use my own family's anecdotal story. When we walked for Autism Speaks, my son came up with a slogan, get perspective. What does get perspective mean? Does that mean get his perspective? No, it meant for him, learn what my perspective is, understand my perspective, you have your perspective, you have your perspective, we all have different perspectives. And there is no one-size-fits-all, neat, tight little box with a bow. You meet one child, you meet every child, and every person is a unique individual that adds to the bigger picture of diversity in our system. So I think that this speaks to the second goal as well, because that's part of a robust or full educational experience. It's not just 2 + 2 = 4. It's more than that. It's what is my responsibility in following the golden rules in our education and as an individual.
So Casey, how can we best answer your question at the end about this training possibility and timing?
So,
Do you
and
wanna
this may
talk to that?
segue into our next agenda topic. I think the question really is the board open and interested in a fall retreat at some point? And what do we want the focus of that retreat to be? So I can leave it very open-ended from that perspective. I think the only other pieces that I would reiterate at this point is, as these are being scheduled and as the K through 12 leadership team training days are set, you have an open invitation. So we can communicate more of that as it becomes clear in terms of logistics and go from there. But I think that would be my question back, is the board's appetite for a fall retreat. with at least a component of that retreat, including some work in leveraging. I do think having a third-party consultant to come in and help create some leadership training opportunities would be my recommendation, and certainly I can do more to help set all that up as we're getting closer to what that might be.
So you introduced this though as part of the communications, if you will. So that's Teresa, right, and Tiffany. You guys are that's your big rock, if you will. And yet it focuses on another big rock specific, but it's still, I think it's the process or the overall building a relationship that's probably what drives this, and that's why you've done it this way.
It's well said. I'm not sure that I had the full 100% intent of getting it done exactly that way, because we could have very easily come at it through a different goal as well. But yeah, thanks for calling that out.
So the question then I would ask Teresa and Tiffany is, do you guys want to kind of work hand in hand with Casey on this effort specifically and kind of just pull the rest of the board members in so you guys listen, learn, and lead from a board perspective?
Sure. I don't know if I'm on. I am on. Are you speaking specifically to these 2 points, Chris, or just in general?
This whole presentation.
Yeah, I think the short answer is sure. I think I can speak because Tiffany and I have had a couple of conversations, and actually we have a working document right now that...
Does this fit that? Or it fits within
absolutely,
it?
I think it would fit because, and this is also somewhat related to, a lot of our goal, I'm trying to pull it up here, is...
Are listening and leaning in.
Yes, but not just, we have prioritizing partnerships with parents, stakeholders, et cetera, but we also have, I think, some very valuable work that could be done in terms of prioritizing communication and partnership as a board and as a board with our administrative team. So I see it as only a positive and a very effective way to get to a highly functional position so that we can really move forward with the entire strategic plan. So sure.
When we talked about forging strong community relationships and fostering effective communication, something we've been discussing is when we looked at our goals, we're looking at each piece of that 5 bullet points is important in and of itself, but is there a tie-in that flows? So we started with number 1 of prioritizing partnerships with our parents, staff, and students in the educational process, and then going into town halls, or would that look like coffee hours or site visits with staff, us being present at events and engaging with our students and developing and extending. Number 2 is developing and extending outreach efforts to target and include residents and community partnerships. And where I think that even this ties into that is because this is still part of a bigger picture. And Casey, when you said of note is that community members are not included in this part right here, and I understand that, but I think that in the end result, it does become a bigger community discussion, and it naturally fits into as it evolves that piece would be communicated out. And the report is in January, for example, just as an example. So I think that yes is the short answer. The long way around, the short answer of yes.
Excellent, and I agree. I actually look at this as how we do those things, right? It's the approach. It's how we go about it. And that's what I really like about this is not the what we accomplish specifically, but how we go about it. It's inclusion. It's recognition of diversity. It's, so the approach itself is why I thought, well, gosh, that's the way we should be looking at everything in Big Rock number 5, right?
Yeah, it might be a good way to frame how we go forward with with the long-term strategic plan in terms of what parts of it are foundational and what parts of it are more action-oriented. And but the action will be more effective when it's rooted in a foundational plane that
Goal.
we've all been involved in.
Excellent. I
So,
agree.
yeah, one of our points was to promote and ensure ongoing feedback loops for internal and external stakeholders. And that speaks directly to design and implement listening sessions to listen to the stories and lived experiences of students, families, and staff relating to issues of equity. That fits right in with that feedback loop.
Question of specificity, Casey, those K through 12 leadership team focus meetings, are those facilitated?
Yes, by us. We do our own preparation and facilitation.
Okay, and so if
amongst-
any of us wanted to go, do we need to RSVP?
I will have Vicky coordinate that with you. So as soon as we have a location, the time is already identified. So those 3 dates plus a future spring meeting that we'll determine. Those are Fridays, and they're built into our naturally occurring either PLC or work days. So we reserve a couple hours in the afternoon to be able to do that.
Are the sessions iterative or redundant?
They're iterative, but we can also catch you up if you're not happening to be there for the first or the second one. We can make sure that they're very easy to. Well, and I will say this: we haven't done something quite like this yet, so we'll be learning right alongside. But I think they're designed in such a way that. As leaders of the work, that we leave feeling both empowered and to whatever extent equipped to be able to take and shape that work into our daily practice. And that's the beautiful thing about all of what we're talking about here is that it's constantly building. We're constantly learning. There's never you got to this point and so therefore you're like, quote unquote, the expert. I mean, we all desire expertise, of course, but we're all on this journey, and we're supporting each other in that process as well.
And we're not going to tackle all the big rocks this month, right? I mean, practically speaking, we got to focus, and I think this hits the biggest need, frankly, at the moment.
I feel like it is a good next step for us, and it's one that has been, to whatever degree, paused. So it's a good opportunity for us to unpause and work forward and go at it less with a end state of here's everything that we're going to do, but really, and I love how we're positioning the process and how we do this, helping inform part of our outcome. So I do think that that's a real important piece, and something else that you mentioned earlier, Chris, in terms of the risks that are associated, right, by working into these types of conversations. I think it's also important for us to mention there's a lot of risk if we don't have these conversations. So that's a real key component for us to make sure that we're considerate of as well.
Well, Teresa, I appreciated what you said there, that this is how we address this becomes sort of our common language. If we can build this into the DNA of the board and how we operate, so much the better, right? Mm-hmm. So I like that.
Thank you.
Which kind of takes us to the last agenda item, if you will, and that's just these board agendas themselves. Casey added just the strategic plan and the key goals, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have talked about having the board agenda itself, every item, where does it fit within this framework? Or better yet, perhaps, why don't we just have the board agenda follow these 5 steps, and whatever needs to be addressed fits within one of these 5 steps. That way we'll know if we're working on big rocks or small pebbles. And I really want us to focus on these big rocks, right? So any thoughts, comments around organizing the agenda, the monthly board agenda around these 5 goals, so that everything that's business that we have to address fits within these areas? Not meaning we cover them all every meeting, everything that we do cover fits within the pattern. over time, it will show us where we're focusing our efforts and whether or not we're balanced in that approach, or if we're missing something.
I think it's easier to arrange the agenda that shows how each item fits into the strategic plan versus building an agenda around, like, I want to make sure we're not missing something that comes up urgent. Sometimes there's going to be things in our agenda that may not be okay, let's hit points 1 through 5. But like you say, we have to talk about nutrition services. How does that fit in? And then we're going to vote on this policy. How's that fit in? That's easier to, I think, outline than say, okay, making sure that what do we have that we can talk about that fits into safety and security. But the
But
other
would
way.
you be okay if we just asked Casey to, if it can't fit in 1 through 4, it'll just go into 5?
No,
I
a
caught
lot
that.
can go in 5, I agree.
And generally speaking, we'll learn as we do that, right? Because it's a change. And so as we do it, we'll refine it and address whatever we face, right? Is that okay with everyone then, if we start having our monthly board agenda follow the big rock layout?
So I think there's a lot of value in consistency and cadence, not just for us, but for the community we serve, so they know what to expect. We likely, to Tiffany's point, should have a spot on the agenda for non-traditional wildcard items, call it what you will, that might warrant our
Traditionally, it's-
attention, that don't
Traditionally, it's BOE miscellaneous.
yeah, but you get my point, right? Yeah. But
Okay.
the value of consistency and cadence is very, very important, especially when you don't meet frequently.
Excellent.
For what it's worth, I also do like that we are working, when we're working on our work session, how does our work session tie into our regular board meeting, our action items are our regular board meeting, our work sessions are our brainstorming discussion. So we're going in with a full plate of knowledge going into our regular board meetings. And I think if we're doing this way also, it allows for us to have information and agendas to release earlier. For example, here's a prime example. This board, we had our agenda released last week. It's a Labor Day weekend, so there may be some points that have been missed because we have the holiday weekend, and now here we are in our board meeting. So this allows for us to be more consistent and making sure that it's reliable too. So having our work and tie into our regular board meetings makes sense.
Yeah, hopefully the work session today, we talked a bit about the strategic plan and deferred maintenance and the budget. That's going to be on our board meeting, right? So this is, in some respects, prepping us for this month's board meeting. And I want to bring that correlation even tighter so that our work sessions really do focus on the upcoming board meeting and those issues, so that we don't get it the weekend before, but we have 2 weeks to actually, we discuss it, and then we have 2 weeks to talk and think and provide feedback. Fair enough?
So if I may, real quick, to tie that all together, our upcoming September 21st regular meeting currently has the following discussion/action items included. We'll be hearing from Monument Academy in their annual report. And so that is a standard item that was pushed back an extra month this year just due to everything that we're currently dealing with the pandemic. We will have a standing item, which is our financial planning and analysis. That'll mirror a lot of what we did this last regular meeting in August. The one thing I would say is that we're still not quite ready yet by September to make sure that we have everything completely accounted for with the revised October 1 count. So that won't be until later in the October regular meeting. We are going to give you an update on our new hire and any staffing fluctuations. That is a year-over-year report. There was an item about a discussion around CASB delegate assembly, but I think you're going to handle that in your board member comments, Ms. Upchurch.
Yes, sir.
So at this point, it's a pretty shorter agenda than what we're typically used to. So that would be my next question. Ron, anything that?
Yeah, if possible, one of the things we've been chatting about, we haven't had the opportunity to go through as a team, is where we are with respect to Grace Best.
So I'm not sure that that is going to be ready by the 21st. That's cutting it really close, but I think we can get it to you by the following work session, which is October, sorry, help me, October 6th? October 6th, that can be a work session item.
May I attempt to establish a set of expectations for that?
That'd be great.
So, and if I'm not speaking correctly for the team or miss something, I trust you guys will jump in. We'd like to understand what the value of the asset is financially. If we liquidate it, we'd like to understand what the value of the cost of the asset would be to turn it into a 21st century agile educational facility. We'd like to understand what the, if any, cost would be if we maintain it under its current role. And then we'd like to understand the time frames that might be associated with those options. And the rationale behind that is an attempt to assess the net worth and the net value to the students, staff, and community of the assets within the district.
And can I add one additional bullet point?
Please.
I think we'd also need to add if we monetize the asset or do something else with it, what we would do with the existing programs that are utilizing that facility.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm looking to the past here. All right.
So let me ask you all a question as well, because it occurs to me that, we finalized the budget in June 30th or whatever, the last day of the fiscal year, but we said it was flexible, right? And that we weren't really going to finalize it until possibly as long as January. Is there any reason that we shouldn't try and finalize it in October board meeting? Because by then we'll know what the student count is, we know what the PPR, and the rest of it is a result of that. Rather than waiting till January, because we'll know what our head count, our student count is, we'll know what the PPR is. It seems to me that we should be able to finalize the budget in October, by our October board meeting.
I'd like to see what Casey thinks about that. Would you have any objections?
I think we can get pretty darn close. I would just ask for the potential of additional adjustments as we're calculating what the impact of that total revenue, plus or minus what we were budgeted, what we set our budget on. I think we can get pretty close. I just want to make sure that we give ourselves a little bit of cushion if we needed to make any additional adjustments. I think we can call those out for you, so you know exactly what line items that would be speaking to. I think we can get pretty close by October. It's the last week of October, so I think we'll be, I don't know if I can put a percent on it, 95% of the way there? Okay, I got a thumbs up on a 95%.
Quick question on that. In the spring, when we kind of went through this and we realized we could do a flexible model, which certainly gave us a lot more choice, one of the concerns was that the state might come up with a budget rescission. And my question is there a particular time that the state has to do that by statute, or can they do that at any time? That's question one. And question two, is there any credible feedback on if that's even under consideration?
I think the answer to the first question is there is not a timeline that I'm aware of that the state has to operate on at whatever point they're saying, hey, we're going to take money back. I think they can do that at any given point. the second point is we haven't heard serious discussion about that since it was last spring. I don't anticipate any additional discussion about that, but I will keep my ears closely attuned in the event that that turns into something that we would have to be concerned about.
I think that was one of the reasons why we were thinking about the January timeline, in addition to
Yes.
the monies coming in from the CARES Act
Yes.
and whatever else might be allocated, just to give us some leeway. And if I recall, the CARES Act is through December 31st, correct? But you guys, it sounds like by October you'd have a good handle on, hopefully we're using all that money and
Pretty
we'll know
good.
where it's allocated.
Pretty good. We're pretty good on CARES allocation in terms of what our game plan is. I mean, that money we know will be spoken for. The ripple effect then to general fund as a function of what we still have to be, that we're still obligated to see through. There will probably be a domino effect that we need to make sure we're completely precise on. And I think we'll be pretty close, like I say, by October, but just a little bit of cushion in there as well. Yeah.
Well, Ron and Teresa both make good points, because there's still the potential that there's federal law beyond the CARES too. So we don't even know, it may or may not happen, but you're right. That's one reason we said, well, let's keep it flexible. So the October 25th, we won't necessarily finalize it then, or October, whatever the date is, but I think an update is still important, that we see that regularly.
Yes.
And the October timeframe, a pretty thorough review, and then do it again in January as a final effort, if you will.
That'd be great.
All right, so the only thing left is board member comments, if you're up for it. So Teresa, can I start with you and we'll work down the row today?
Sure, and I guess I just need to, we've gone on a little bit. So I guess my only comments were going to be what I have worked on with Ron and Tiffany in terms of moving some big rocks forward. But I'd rather do it as just a short debrief, and then I guess we'd want to talk about when there might be an opportunity. I think Ron and I are at a point where we're ready, given maybe one or two more conversations, to present to the board what we've been accumulating and digesting and would like to put out. But this point that I was going to speak to was the physical security point. We've had a number of conversations with Mr. Coates and are at a point where we've delineated it down to a graph that we could share with the board at an upcoming meeting, and would like to do that. I don't know that I'll necessarily go through specifics on today.
Well, let me ask you, would you be ready in 2 weeks?
We can be. Mm-hmm.
So we could add that to our agenda in 2 weeks?
Sure. And thank you. That's great. And then Tiffany and I have a working document. We've actually gone back to our 5 points bulleted under our goal number 5, and we realized we needed to make sure that we were the specificity of that language was important to both of us, so that's where we're working at on that. And also starting to list out action items for the board as a whole in terms of communication, with stakeholders, with parents, families, both outside of board and admin, but then also intercommunication. So I just wanted to let my fellow board members know that that work is continuing. It's active on both accounts and moving forward. And then I'd just like to thank everyone for the work we've done today. It feels like we've gotten through quite a lot of content, and appreciate your time.
Thank you, Teresa. Tiffany?
Teresa actually did a pretty thorough job of covering. I'm excited and eager to dive into ensuring high quality instruction and relevant educational experience for all students. And this summer, with all that's had to go into, and the work that Mr. Frampton and Dr. Benton have put into our programming. That is a huge undertaking, and the leadership of not just you guys, but also everybody, the team, the entire district. It is been inspiring to see the team effort that has gone into that. I agree, this has been a long meeting, but deep diving has been really beneficial. So that's all I actually have to say. I think
Thank you,
we've said
Tiffany.
enough. I've said enough throughout.
Ron? Just a couple of very quick things. Number one, we've been here nearly 3 hours, and I haven't heard the word COVID mentioned once. So something very good, something very good must be happening. So number one, and number two, congratulations on the district and the staff for running this long with such few cases and providing everything that the community had asked for. So great job so far. Thank you guys. Thirdly, thanks to Rick and Dennis for working with Teresa and I and helping us move crisply and swiftly into actually being in a position to where we can deliver something that yields results. Because again, there's no value to our work unless we yield results. And to Tiffany's and Teresa's points, we have a great framework to begin that work, and we've already started the momentum and the inculcation of discussion and ideas so that we can get it to where it's a mature and usable set of documents that we can act on. So thank you guys during this really hard time for making that investment in our students and your staffs. Matt?
Thank you, Ron. Just want to thank everyone. You know, I kind of concur with the comment that Ron just made that we haven't heard much about COVID-19. I think that's indicative of how things are running so smoothly with their schools. Also want to congratulate Monument Academy on their ribbon cutting ceremony and them opening that school up. And that's all I have, Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Matt. Thank all of you for your progress and the work. I know a lot of us behind the scenes, until we meet, you don't fully appreciate how much time and effort you're doing. I look forward to your presentation. I really do. I'm excited to see it. I agree with the comments I've heard about the deep dive today and how it's been meaty, right? It's been very helpful for me to help gain focus on what we can do better. I want to just express to our entire school system my hope and my prayers that we don't have an outbreak that causes us to have to shift gears any more than what's happened so far. I feel fortunate, but you don't have to read the news very long to see that in some parts of the country it's actually a big outbreak, and we're fortunate where we live, I think, in some respects, but I think it's, also our community tries to take care of itself, and that's a good thing, and I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful for Dr. Summers and his leadership in our school system to press forward with all caution, with all respect to governmental authority and public health. He's pushed forward and created an opportunity for parents to make choices about how they continue this education process. I think it's I can't think of the right words to express how proud I am of your work. And it is appreciated, and I would be remiss if I didn't say that. And finally, I just, would like to add that I talked a little bit about my tribe and our biases, and I would just like to add that we love this community. We love where we live. This community fits us so very well. And having said that, I'd like to ask Dr. Summers if he has any comments he'd like to end with.
Just very quickly, and thank you for those comments, and thank you all for all the great support. What I really value and appreciate both about this meeting and how we're moving forward is that there is clarity, there's focus, and there's alignment. And while there's still a lot of challenges that are built into all of that, we're really committed to ensuring that we're driving the system forward with a focus on a positive impact for each of the students in our care. So with that, I just appreciate all the leadership that's being invested in that process. Thank you.
Well, then we're adjourned.
That was good form there, Chris.